Thank you for listening to the Unconventional Ministry Podcast. I'm Dennis Wiens, your host, Senior Impact Catalyst at Sat7 USA. As I've approached retirement, over the years, various people have suggested numerous hobbies for me to consider doing in my retirement. Some of their suggestions have been doing woodworking projects, painting, photography, and one suggestion was even I could be a greeter at Walmart. Maybe you have some suggestions for me as well. None of these seem to appeal or fit my skill set or experiences. One of the aspects of my work with Sat7 USA is the opportunity I have to travel, and as I travel, to network and to hear people's stories. I've met many people, heard their stories, and had many small world stories come out of it. With the travels, I've found it inspiring to see how God works through people across the world in fun, engaging, innovative, and creative ways. After hearing so many stories, I decided to share them through podcasting. With over 5 million podcasts worldwide and over 70 million podcast episodes amongst them, I questioned whether we needed another podcast. 78% of Americans have heard a podcast. Of those who have heard a podcast, 28% listen weekly. For me, that means some in that 28% category would listen to stories of ministry innovation and people making a difference for others. Yes, I concluded that there was room for another podcast, so I host the Unconventional Ministry Podcast. Each Tuesday, there's a new episode of the podcast that I host. Please check it out and let me know what you think. I share stories I hear of the innovative and creative ways people are making a difference in ministry in their local areas. The podcast is a conversation about fresh ministry ideas, new approaches, and collaborative efforts. You can find the podcast on your favorite podcast platform like Apple Podcasts. It is also on Podbean. I've learned so much from each episode, and I'm confident you will as well. Here are some of the podcast episode titles. The first one, Revolutionizing Church Mission Displays, Creating an Interactive Experience. Now, this one was really interesting to me because I come from a missions background, a strong legacy in ministry and missions. I grew up as a TCK, third culture kid. Sometimes we're called MKs, missionary kids, in sub-Saharan West Africa. So my folks wrote prayer letters, and we wrote prayer letters our whole career, had churches that were supporting us, and it was always a challenge. How do you keep that church up to date on what's happening in the ministries? How do you tell stories? A lot of churches have a missions display in the back of the church or in the basement or down some hallway, and it's a map with many outdated prayer cards or family pictures. But to have an updated, revolutionizing, interactive digital missions display was really a great idea. Another podcast episode was Lessons Learned visiting 57 immigrant churches, and that was my guest that lives in Minneapolis. He learned a lot of lessons, and most people haven't even visited one immigrant church, and you'll be surprised how difficult it is for the American church and the immigrant church to work together. Be sure you listen to that episode. Another episode was Music's Powerful Force in Healing People from Trauma. Fascinating, the power of music. Another episode was Ending the Epidemic of Poor Vision in Developing Countries. And what's unique here is that they're doing this for just a few dollars per person. And be sure you catch that and connect with them. Another episode was Missions Innovation in the Context of Urbanization, Globalization, and Multi-Directional Migration. The missions model that most churches follow is really focused on a more rural context where the majority world is moving to cities and urban centers. And so some new ideas about a missions model for moving forward. Another episode of the Unconventional Ministry Podcast was Pastor's Retirement, Why Too Few Plan or Prepare. You want to send this episode to your pastors, to your church leadership, to ministry people, because this is really important and it could make a real difference for ministry people, pastors, as they plan for retirement. Another episode was finding meaning amid personal tragedy. And you hear about so many personal tragedies. How can you find meaning in that? This episode was really amazing how their therapy to work through their tragedy was to help others. And they've helped over 1,000 families now. And what I didn't know is that when there's a terminal diagnosis of a child in the family, within a year, 70% of parents will separate or divorce. And this family was determined that wouldn't happen, and they've helped 1,000 families now. Not one of them has separated or divorced. Another podcast episode was the Third Culture Kid, TCK, Cultural Adaptability in a Multicultural World. This was fascinating to think about missionary kids, third culture kids, and their move back to the U.S. and some of the challenges they go through. And you think of all the refugees and immigrants that are coming to our country, and they face the same thing. And businesses where children grow up international, and coming back, they have some of these same challenges. So be sure to listen to that Third Culture Kid, TCK, Cultural Adaptability. Sat7 USA sponsors the Unconventional Ministry Podcast. Sat7 is a Middle East and North Africa broadcast media ministry based in the Middle East. The ministry produces 80% of all the content on its 4 satellite TV channels across the Middle East and North Africa. The vision is to see a growing church in the Middle East and North Africa that's confident in its faith and in its witness, and a church that's contributing to its culture and to its society. Sat7 endeavors to make the gospel available to everyone in the Middle East and North Africa. Will you join Sat7 in making that endeavor a reality? A starting point is praying for the Middle East and North Africa. I host a monthly prayer Zoom called Beyond Borders Prayer, a monthly Zoom meeting connecting you with on-the-ground Sat7 staff in the Middle East and North Africa. Each month is a different aspect of the ministry. The Beyond Borders Prayer is only 30 minutes long. It is a time to hear firsthand from the Middle East staff person about the challenges of ministering in a region where 97% of the people are non-Christian, and how can we pray more effectively to make God's love visible. I invite you to join me each month, and you can register at sat7usa.org, SAT7USA.org. Click on the tab, Get Involved, then click on the tab, Join the Prayer Team, and you can register from that link. I will also put the information in the notes for this podcast. Please listen to several podcast episodes and let me know what you think. Which episode was your favorite? And then please share them with a friend. Please consider giving the Unconventional Ministry Podcast a review. This helps position the podcast for more people to learn new ways, new ideas, innovative approaches to ministry. Could podcasting and being the host of the Unconventional Podcast be my retirement hobby? In our changing world, there are more ways than ever to do ministry. Sat7 as a broadcast media ministry is changing how ministry is done. Through innovative approaches, collaborative efforts, broadcast satellite television, web streaming, and social media, Sat7 is making a difference. Visit Sat7 online today at SAT7USA.org to learn ways you can be a part of this kingdom work. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your friends. If you know of an unconventional ministry approach, please introduce us. We'd like to have them on as guests. Thank you again for joining this episode of the Unconventional Ministry Podcast.